Hey guys, Ryan Martian here, and today I'm going to be discussing a scene from a film that was basically two-thirds of my entire childhood, and a large portion of my adult life as well. The classic Jaws by Steven Spielberg. This is easily the film that I've watched the most during my entire life. There were times when my mother flat out said, "No, you cannot rent that movie again, especially since you were afraid that sharks would come through the shower head the other night." That is not an exaggeration, by the way. That was a legitimate, albeit completely irrational thought that went through my little Martian head. The specific scene I'm going to be discussing is Quint's USS Indianapolis monologue, brilliantly delivered by the late Robert Shaw. It's important for many reasons, both on-camera and off-camera wise, and I hope to thoughtfully explain why. As usual, there are major spoilers ahead, but I always want to give you guys a fair warning. You have been warned. First, a little background. It's been noted that Robert Shaw had a pretty severe drinking problem during the majority of the shoot. Richard Dreyfuss, who plays Hooper, is quoted as saying, "Shaw was a perfect gentleman whenever he was sober. All he needed was one drink, and he turned into a competitive son of a bitch." Shaw, while intoxicated, would frequently tease and humiliate Dreyfuss, and, as a result, their on-set relationship was fairly hostile. In a way, this was almost a fortunate accident, because it makes their on-screen relationship even more believable. It's also important to note that Shaw attempted to recite the monologue intoxicated, since the characters in the film had been drinking just prior to it. This version turned out to be unusable, so Shaw decided to act it out sober the next day, in direct contrast to both his on-screen and off-screen habits. Finally, the monologue itself went through many versions. Originally it was 3/4 of a page, written by uncredited writer Howard Sackler. Then it was expanded to almost 10 pages by Spielberg's friend John Milius, but it was deemed to be too long. Robert Shaw took it home himself, reworked it with some of his own input, shortened it to 5 pages, and that is the version which ended up on the screen. Alright, enough background, on to the scene itself. Right before the monologue, it's important to remember our characters were drinking, laughing, and comparing scars, with Quint and Hooper each trying to one-up each other in a very playful manner, and they seem to be finally bonding a bit. Not only their respective characters, but also Shaw and Dreyfuss in real life. In fact, Spielberg wisely shot Quint and Hooper sitting at the table, first at complete opposite sides, showing how far apart the two characters and actors were from each other up until this point. But slowly, over the course of comparing their scars, they come together and are soon occupying the same frame, with the swinging lamp above spotlighting their characters. They are smiling and laughing. The two have finally made a connection. This whole time, Chief Brody is absent both physically and camera-wise. He is standing off to the side in the dark, and at one point looks at his old appendix scar, realizing he has nothing to add. It was a very important moment for both Quint and Hooper, as well as Shaw and Dreyfuss, and Spielberg knew exactly how to relate this to the audience with some simple but very effective camera work. Brody notices a scar on Quint's arm, and while smiling and basking in this lighthearted moment, asks, "What's that one?" Quint informs Brody it was a tattoo he had removed. After a quick zinger by Hooper, we can see Quint's mood has altered drastically, and he tells him it's the USS Indianapolis. At this point, Hooper's mood also does an abrupt 180, and Quint appears to be already reliving the horror all over again in his head. Brody innocently, and while still smiling, asks, "What happened?" Now, I'm going to link a clip for this scene in the description. I don't want to go through every line of the monologue. You really have to watch it yourself, and it's not really the point of this analysis. What I do want to discuss are the aspects of this scene, acting and filmmaking wise, that makes it so memorable and frightening. First and foremost, we have Robert Shaw's subdued and brilliantly nuanced performance. He conveys the horrifying story perfectly with both his words and facial expressions, alternating between dead seriousness and some perfectly placed smirks. I have always felt that the goal of a great and successful storyteller is their ability to visually paint a picture in the audience's head with only their words. In this particular case, we also had the added bonus of Shaw's visual acting to enhance the story and make it more believable. He knocks it out of the park, just like his old friend Herbie Robinson from Cleveland. We, as the audience, can picture everything he says without it distracting us from the actual performance occurring on the screen. Most importantly, we finally realize and understand Quint's motivation, and the reason behind his hatred of sharks. War, in and of itself, can be a fairly traumatic experience, but when you add fending off swarming sharks for over a week into the equation, Quint has a form of PTSD that altered his life forever and steered it in a direction that he may never thought was possible. Next, we have Richard Dreyfuss and Roy Scheider playing the perfect background characters. Shaw's monologue and performance are what we should be focusing on, and the way they act and are shot by Spielberg is a true testament of restraint. They act as if Quint is their grandfather telling an old war story. They cannot take their eyes off him during the entire scene. Hooper is almost in a state of shock. At times, his mouth is literally hanging open. Spielberg wisely kept him in most of the shots with Quint because it furthers the bond they just experienced, along with the humanization of their characters. Hooper, the naive rich boy who Quint cannot stop ragging on, knew right away exactly what happened when Quint mentioned the USS Indianapolis. It's important to note that Dreyfuss cannot take his eyes off of Shaw while he recites a monologue. Now, this is probably mostly acting on his part, but I believe there's a little bit more to it. Even though him and Shaw couldn't stand each other, Dreyfuss as a person, and also a member of the audience at this point, realizes a great performance is occurring right next to him. Conversely, Brody, the older and wiser of the two, had to ask what happened. He sinks further into the dark, both literally and figuratively, as his fear of sharks is reinforced even more so. This is accomplished in a few ways, not only with the look of absolute fear on his face, and how his black shirt almost melts into the darkness of the boat's cabin surrounding him, but also with Quint staring directly into Brody's eyes while telling the story. We also have the bone-chilling score from John Williams accompanying Quint as he recites the monologue. His main Jaws theme is the piece everyone justly and understandably remembers, but this particular piece shows just how great Williams is at perfectly capturing what is happening on the screen through music. It's mostly a few screeching violins played in a very high register, along with some low woodwinds to balance the violins out. It's not loud and in your face, as that would have been completely inappropriate, as well as a distraction. It also starts about halfway through Quint's monologue, perfectly fusing at just the right moment, giving Shaw's performance some time to breathe on its own before joining the already intense atmosphere. It succeeds at adding that perfect extra pinch of eeriness to the top of what is happening visually on the screen without taking the audience away from it. The monologue and scene closes with a shot focusing solely on Quint. Spielberg tastefully uses a slow zoom to bring the audience closer and closer to Shaw during his final words. Brody and Hooper are no longer necessary at this point, because this is all about Quint and the absolute horror he experienced, which changed his life forever, on June the 29th, 1945. As always, guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this analysis, and if you did, drop a like or subscribe. Thanks again.